Informally now. Welcome everyone into tonight's live on-air discussion. We've got two really interesting speakers tonight looking at the 4 questions of practical theology. Our speakers are the Rev Abhishek Solomon, Abi, in Warkworth, New Zealand, and the Rev Dr John Evans, who's in Melbourne. And I'd like to begin by asking each of them to just give us a couple of minutes talking about themselves, what they do, what their interests are. So maybe, Abi, would you like to lead off?
Sure. Thank you, David, for having me, and it's wonderful to be here. I am currently I'm a minister here at Warkworth, Mahurangi Methodist Parish, and been here for past 18 months or so. And previously to entering into full-time ministry, I was working with young people in Oxford as a youth work coordinator. So that was an interesting experience, and that sort of led me into ordained ministry. And I have a passion for people and ministry, and also committed to and devoted to academic studies, particularly continental philosophy, exploring the horizon of life and meaning and interface of religion and politics and sociology, particularly looking into the theory of Derrida and Foucault and Marx and Freud, and how what kind of neurosis is created from there, and so on. So, and how the theological dimensions within that, the theological undercurrent within their work. So exploring that, and so I'm always interested in sort of the practical, contextual stuff that is happening around on individual and also on the collective level. So yeah,
great. Thank you for that, Abi. I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to bring some of your interest in philosophy into the practical theological situations that we're going to discuss tonight. So let's move over to Melbourne and the Rev Dr John Evans, who's a very good close friend of mine.
Good evening, David, and good evening others who are listening to this program. Yes, my name is John, and I've been a Uniting Church minister. That's a union of Methodist, Presbyterian and Congregational churches here in Australia for just on 30 years. Currently I'm a minister in Carlton, and the name of our church is Church of All Nations. That indicates that way back in the 1960s, on the block back of the back of the church, there were built high-rise towers, and people from all around the world came to Melbourne, to Australia, migrants, and the then minister had the vision that well, they needed a place to worship, and there was a translation service for services in 4 or 5 different languages. So it became, in the 1960s, Church of All Nations. We today only a smallish congregation. We would have had this morning 40, 45 at worship. During the week, we offer a community service program to people who are living in the high-rise towers. Today, many of those are from the Horn of Africa. They are refugees in Australia, perhaps been here for 10 to a dozen years. A majority of those are Muslim people. The others are previous waves of migration, or people with mental health issues, addiction problems, women who are fleeing domestic violence. It's a rather interesting place, that part of Carlton. On the other side of the street, Carlton is an inner city suburb of Melbourne and is a vibrant community. It's got the Melbourne University, RMIT University within its bounds, and so there are lots of students and bookshops and restaurants and very middle-class intellectual endeavours happen on the other side of the street. So we're located in the middle of all this, and we endeavour to be a church in that context. As for me, my background is once was a lawyer, and I've served in a variety of parish settings and also institutional leadership roles within the church. Anything from being a university college principal to a general secretary, administrative bureaucrat within the life of the church. There we are.
There you go. Well, thank you, guys. That's an excellent introduction to yourselves, and we're going to now start to use your knowledge to look at these particular issues, and in a few seconds I will bring up the screen share so that folk can see what it is that we're on to discussing tonight. And you can see there are the 4 primary questions of practical theology. Universally accepted questions, not just in practical theology, but in just about every discipline, I guess. But we want to apply them to the topics that are listed: bad dreams, euthanasia, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender sexuality issues, and suicide. Now, I've just noted that we've got 6 viewers in with us at present, and the viewers can ask questions. There is a question pod that they can type in their questions, and if we're able to get a few during the broadcast, that would be great. But we've got plenty of questions and hopefully 1 or 2 answers that we could perhaps generate tonight. So without any further ado, I'd like to take us to the euthanasia debate, because this is really getting quite a lot of publicity in New Zealand at present, and there are moves afoot to introduce some liberalisation of laws around this. And I'd just like to know how the 2 of you interpret the right of someone to choose how they die and when they die. So over to Abhi and John.
It's a critical question about life and death. We're asked to think of what's the major issue involved in this, and it is the question of life and death. Recently, I came across a quote from, of all people, a former United Nations Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld. And the question of euthanasia and suicide, I think, can be quite closely linked, because is life actually worth living because of the pain you might be having or the intolerable nature of your disease? And he wrote, so when he wanted to commit suicide, so that's the way in which you can be tempted to conquer loneliness and to take the ultimate flight from life. No, it may be that death is to be your final gift to life, but it must not be an act of treachery against it. I think what happens in our society is that we can't discuss death very well. Understand death, well, is the final act of life. We need to accept death, not avoid death. But the real question, as Hammarskjöld indicated there, is that, well, we've been given the gift of life, and we need not to be treacherous towards life. Now, that opens up the question, what is, well, the real meaning of life? What is important in living? Has life lost its importance for you as perhaps a sufferer? And I guess I think of the situation where there is intolerable pain, but I also think of the situation where people are just not feeling well, feeling somewhat blue, dark on the depressed. This whole issue of euthanasia and what the nature of life and death should be has been recently highlighted with the case of Dr. Philip Nitschke, known as Dr. Death, a strong advocate of euthanasia in Australia. And he was disbarred as a medical practitioner recently because he assisted a person who was depressed to die. Now, this seemed to, in the minds of the Medical Registration Board, to go beyond. It was treachery against life, rather than what he normally has been involved in would be people who are suffering intolerable pain and illness. Without answering the question, so they're some of the framework of trying to perhaps unpack what a Christian attitude, a pastoral, practical theology attitude might be towards euthanasia and suicide.
Okay, thanks for that framework, John. Abhi, you got any particular comments? I've got a first question has appeared. I'd like to hear from you first of all. Do you have any comments about the framework that John's outlined?
Let me begin with a quote, as John began with, a quote by Jacques Lacan, who was a French psychoanalyst. He said that death is possibly the best inventions of life. And by saying that, what he did was he was addressing the binary logic upon which Western thinking functions, that is black and white, the whole sort of you and me and those sort of like in and out, and he was trying to deconstruct the whole thinking, and he was trying to show that life and death are actually, they coexist, they reinforce each other, they are intersubjective rather than they oppose each other. And secondly, I was recently reading a book by a Jewish psychotherapy therapist, Yalom, and he was talking about that in our society we have different kinds of fears, and what drives our life is a fear. We are driven by fear, and he identifies 4 different kinds of fears, and one of them is death. And he says that from the moment we are born, we work towards avoiding death. We do everything what we can do. We come up with different means and medicines and technology, safety and security to avoid death. And so death has a very bad name in our society, as you said, John. I personally feel that we do not even have language, a healthy language to deal with the topic of death. And it is seen as something obscene, something out there, something mysterious, something we are meant to be afraid of, at the end of something. But at the same time, from Judeo-Christian perspective, I think the Christianity or the Judeo-Christian framework offers a particular understanding of life and death, where life is, we are caught up in this eternity, where when we die, we continue to live, but in a different form. We continue, our life continues. So death in itself is a form of life. And so the life continues through death, in a sense.
Okay, I wonder if I could just feed into the conversation at this point, because both of those interpretive frameworks are really fundamental to the issue that we want to discuss. Max Thompson has asked the question, I'll just select this, Max. Are euthanasia and suicide separate, or do they overlap? Now, using your different frameworks, what do you make of Max's question? And anyone's free to feed questions and comments in while we're getting an answer here.
Well, I think, yes, they do overlap in that, at a practical level, that in many respects what euthanasia is assisted suicide. Someone is not able to actually do the job themselves because of their illness or disability, whatever, and they're assisted in ending their life. So yes, that question I think can overlap. Now that's begging the question with regard to what is our attitude towards life and death, and that comes back to well, for me anyway, is life, and the fullness of life is a core aspect of our understanding of being a Christian, and we offer to people in, well, our preaching and pastoral care and various other forms, you know, the sacraments, whatever. One of the things that I think I mentioned before and has also been mentioned by Abi was the fact of we fear death. We're a death-denying sort of society. That quote I had from Hummerskull tries to draw it together. And the way we then react to fearing death is we always want to be in control. That's a very human thing. And
yeah,
it even goes to the point of being in control with regard to death.
Yeah, control is very much an issue for all sorts of reasons. For example, when you when you retire, you give up certain forms of control. When you move to a new position, whatever, you give up certain forms of control and others take over. Abi, could I get you to, do you see from your perspective that euthanasia are separate, or do they euthanasia and suicide separate, or do they overlap?
Yes, that's an interesting question, because certainly they appear, the form or the structure of it is quite similar, but they seem to have, as I understand at least, different logics behind them. And the different logic is working behind it. A suicide is interesting idea, because I have youth ministry. I have come across people, and in my own family, my cousin who committed suicide, and so on, and so suicide in both sense. While one person has, they seem to have their own choice. I want to take my life, and so I can take. And with euthanasia, also, I want to be in charge and control of my own life. And what is interesting is that both cases, we want to control life. We don't want to control death, but we want to control life. We want to regulate life and channel it in a certain way, in a certain dimension, and that is toward death in both euthanasia and suicide. And so both ends of controlling life, controlling death. And so death is the destination where we go. But person who commits suicide may have a completely different logic or behind it than euthanasia. So even though they seem to be expressed or have a similar form, what is behind it, what animates it, the desire, is quite different, I think.
Right. Just sticking with that, Abi, we just had a little bit of an audio delay there. And but here's a particular pastoral situation that arose in the suicide line that I'd like your comment on. I think, Max, that we've actually done answering your question. That Abi and John take a different perspective each on how integrated these two are. But Abi, I had a pastoral situation where a younger woman committed suicide, and her parents said that there was really no other option for her. She wasn't physically ill, but her whole adult life and late teenage years, she had been haunted by different voices, and each day was a struggle with those voices. So in that sense, do you think that she made a choice that was valid for her, that actually to live life was harder and produced a kind of mental torment for her, and so that the parents believe that she actually chose a creative solution? Any comments about that, Abhi? And then John, if you wouldn't mind commenting on that.
I mean, it's an interesting case because exactly the same thing happened in my family, in my cousin who committed suicide because life just got too much, and he just went off and hung himself. But the question arises out of, is it a form of escape and you know, escaping the challenges of life and so on to something else, and so that becomes a whole interesting concept and topic, and how do we channel, how do we deal with the struggles we have, and also for me, when that person was alive, what was actually going on, and how much support the family was, what was the concrete material situation, social setting within which that person lived, and what was the social context, and all those kind of the interplay. So many different things can lead somebody to the point of committing suicide. But then again, we have people who commit suicide, and I know that, you know, I come from a place from India where India and Pakistan play cricket match, and Pakistan lost and somebody committed suicide. India lost and somebody commits suicide. So we have, you know, the whole what animates somebody to commit suicide is really, really interesting idea. I know somebody, a very dear friend of mine, she lives in Australia, and she is going through absolute trauma in her life from past 15 years, and she's 35 or so, and she often says that I feel that my intellect and my soul is larger and stronger than my body. And she says that it feels like my soul wants to be liberated from the constraints, from the limitations of this fragile body. So
there is a difficulty with that the university chaplains highlighted last week, that unfortunately amongst young people, the suicide thing becomes almost like not a phase, but something that needs to be worked through with a lot of young people, that they may be tempted to take their own lives, but that's not the same situation as the one that I was describing, nor the one that your cousin was in. John,
certainly that your university chaplain situation is one that's very real, because this afternoon I was going for a walk with my wife, who teaches at one of the local universities, and she had just received a phone call from a colleague who had attended the funeral of one of their students who had taken their own life. And all I could say is, what a tragedy, what a tragedy. Because in that context, the fullness of life and what we can do, achieve, and enjoy this world, and what that person could do and be, is lost. And when a person suffers from profound depression and hearing voices and other things, I similarly would say, what a tragedy. But I will always say that, as Hamishkol said, is we need to affirm life. I think that's an important aspect of well, our pastoral care, pastoral responsibility. At least a huge presumption.
I'm going to toss at you. I'm going to toss at you a question from Barbara Miller, Barbara Moller rather, and then I'll toss a question from Stuart Mannins at Arby, because they're both on exactly the things that you're talking about. So Barbara's question, John, is that she says, according to the scriptures, I read somewhere that we as Christians don't have the choice to take our own life, and she's put a question mark. She's asking a question. How do you interpret Scripture? Do we have a choice about this? Does Scripture say anything about what we should do as Christians with regard to this gift of life?
I'm going to confess I'm not. I'm sure there are specific passages with regard to suicide. I just go the other way and say there are truckloads of passages about the fullness of life. Now, how we balance all that, the scripture's full of wars and battles and grisly ends and beheadings and you name it. I, as a Christian, find those accounts and issues very troubling and difficult because it goes against my sense of sisters and brothers living in harmony and community and what that all might offer. Is there a scriptural teaching against suicide? Arby might be able to answer. I'm not quite. I've never gone hunting. I must admit, I've gone from other premises.
But that's a very good answer in the sense that it's not whether there is a scriptural verse that says you can or can't do this. It's rather because the Bible is written over centuries upon centuries and it's accumulated wisdom. The accumulated wisdom of the Bible would affirm the value of the gift of life.
Yeah.
That's the theme. That's the consistent theme. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that question, Barbara. I'm just going to consider that we've done answering that. And Arby, I'm sending you this question from Stuart Mannins, and he says, do you think that suicide and euthanasia might be seen as a form of being in control? That's an interesting question.
Perhaps, maybe. I mean, and I think we all want to control our life, or we want to at least seem to be able to control. We are never what life is never what it seems or what it appears to be. There are certain illusion or delusion is often at work in our interaction with society and so on. And so I sort of resort to Immanuel Kant here, and I think of his idea of how do we relate to ourselves. And he was building on Cartesian logic of I think, therefore I am. He was trying to deal with it, and the idea becomes, are we really in touch with ourselves, and do we really know ourselves, and how do we know who we are? Do I know myself through your eyes or through culture's eyes? So I come from India, and my identity is formed by living in that culture, and because then I end up seeing myself, that I end up interpreting the realities of my life through that culture, through the lens of that particular culture. And so whatever is happening inside me, I am, in that sense, I'm never deeply connected with myself directly, but I'm always mediating through a certain framework, and that certain framework enables me to connect me to myself. And so are we really are we truly able to control our lives? I'm not sure if I agree with that. Whether it's suicide or whether it's euthanasia, certain ideologies are at work, and those ideologies enable us to connect us to ourselves. So there's
Look, I'm really interested in that answer, because I was looking at some of Carl Gustav Jung's insights in preparation for tonight, and Jung notes that this is the fundamental problem with Western philosophy, whether it's in René Descartes Immanuel Kant or any of the big philosophical movements, he noted that in fact these are always trying to move something into outside of ourselves, whereas out of the culture of China and India, you have a much more inward approach that asks about identity and how these outward things are merged, and the inward identity merges with the outward, and the outward merges with the inward. Is that? Am I on the right track with that, Abhi? Is that a fundamental difference?
I absolutely agree, totally, and I think that is the fundamental difference between Western and Eastern logic, and that is, by concretely I mean the logic of Hinduism and Buddhism when I talk about Eastern logic, and it is much more contemplative, sort of like internally processing and regathering our energies, and that's why Buddhism and Hinduism always sort of advocates isolation, as an element of isolation. So, take yourself out from the rush and busyness of life and go and center yourself within yourself, so you can really get to know yourself without all the consumerism, materialism, and whatever is happening outside. On the other hand, we have philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Soren Kierkegaard, who Western philosophers who talks about that we cannot learn truth if the truth is not within ourselves, but the truth lies outside of ourselves. However, they actually do disservice in that sense to the Greek philosophy, which is predominantly Western thinking in a sense. And I'm talking about Socratic framework here. Socratic framework advocates that truth lies deep within ourselves, not outside. So it's much more in line with the Eastern mode of thinking, Socratic understanding of life.
Right. Okay, I think that's a marvelous set of answers from both of you, but another question has come through, this time from Greg Hewson, who's one of the university chaplains that was on live on air a week or so back. And so I think we're done answering that, Stuart. Now, I'm just selecting Greg's question here, and they'll feed this out to both of you because it really is a fundamental issue, I think, for churches. How can Christian leaders and members of churches help reduce the numbers of people taking their own lives each year? He says in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but it could equally be in Australia or India or wherever. How can Christian leaders and members of churches help reduce the number? And that's really a key practical theological question. How might we respond in a personal sense? We've got a couple of interpretive frameworks. We know what we think ought to be going on from the perspective of those frameworks, but what's the personal response here? What's the church personal response? Over to you, John.
Yes, I agree. In Australia, there is an age group of which suicide is the leading cause of death. I don't know whether it finishes at 35, but something of that nature. It really is a great tragedy. What's the church's response? If I can tell a story of what I've experienced here at Church for All Nations, we have each year to deal with people who take their own lives or want to take their own life. Sean would come to Church of All Nations to this one location at the door of our hall and self-harm. He would slash his wrists. And he literally did this on 3 separate occasions. And he did it, I'm sure, at that spot and in this way because he knew we would react. that we would endeavour to talk with him. We would provide some care for him. We would actually listen to his particular story. And we ended up having a routine of what we would do when we saw Sean. He would arrive with his bag of grog. He'd arrive with a brand new knife, and he would just sit on the stairs. Now, as soon as I saw that happen, I would call ambulance and police, because he needed greater professional help. But when, for example, he slit his wrist, I did a first aid course after that experience. We tried to patch him up, and you had the opportunity to talk, and it was quite clear he was thoroughly depressed. No one would listen. No one would hear his rather tragic story. But when he came to the church, we would respond to these cries for help and what he was doing. That's not a global response, how the church, but it was interesting that it was seen to be a place which would affirm life and would listen and would endeavour to provide another paradigm to what he saw was the only way out.
Great. Any comments from you, Abhi, about how churches and church leaders can help reduce the numbers of suicides?
I agree with everything that John said, and the message of church is the message of life, and not just life, but a new life, and a life that gives hope, and a life that is full of acceptance and empowerment, and also being available to genuinely listen to the cries of the oppressed and the cries of those who are, because there's always often something is happening in their life, and what it is that is animating them to bringing them to the point of suicide and so on. So yeah, helping them to get in touch with themselves, really, and offering message of life. So yeah. But
I also think that. Oh, sorry, Abhi, you go for it.
Also, sorry. One more thing I want to add to it, David, is that a Christian church also need to develop the language to talk about death in a helpful fashion, in a helpful manner, and there is two things that church is very inadequate, I feel, and one thing is death, another thing is sexuality. They don't know how to address these two issues properly, and often these two issues are interconnected, and what's happening in somebody's own life. So I see that we need, as a church leaders, to be able to touch on these things that is so repressed in our society, and to be able to talk about it in a healthy and nurturing manner.
Great. I'd also like to add here that I'm sure there are similar programs in Melbourne and the Uniting Church, but our university chaplains, Greg, has got a particular kind of course that he has put together. There are resources that I do think many congregations don't use. It's like there's a sea of resources out there, but church leaders, for whatever reason, maybe they feel, Abhi, that what you said is correct, that they're embarrassed to talk about this in case it does more harm in their opinion than good. But if only we would start to talk about it and develop the language that you're saying, we should be tapping into all the kinds of resources that are available. And I think I don't know whether they call them synods over in the Uniting Church, John, but you know, our New Zealand type synods, those are primary places where we can pick up and resource one another. So Greg, thanks very much for feeding that in. And
Can
I've
I just say
considered that.
one last thing, is that it's very interesting that it's developed on Australian news broadcasts, television news broadcasts, that whenever there is an account of a suicide or a problem of depression, they will always finish with a reference to, and if you're having any difficulties, please ring Lifeline or this particular agency. Now, that's become such the norm of elevating. This is something that feel free to talk about. Don't just suppress. And the irony there is that Lifeline began out of Wesley Mission in Sydney as an agency, and indeed today is in many instances run as a uniting church caring agency for just listening to people and providing help if they are feeling depressed or wish to take their own life.
Yeah, and I think we've got a similar thing on various television events here. That's a very helpful comment, John. Thanks for that. Greg, I think we're done answering your question. I've got one that I would like you to consider from Nehalofi. Nehalofi is a Tongan woman minister over in Epsom in Auckland, and we'll deal with this, and then when we've dealt with Nahi's question, we will very briefly look at the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender issue. We'll only have a couple of minutes tonight. But here's from Nahi, and I suspect that she's got a real point here, and Abhi started to unpack this. She says, we live in a multicultural society, and the action of euthanasia impacts on us Tongans with a kind of sensitivity in term, and do we have the sensitivity of diverse cultural perspectives? Are we aware of other cultures? And that was your point, wasn't it, Abhi? That there are different cultural ways of perceiving this.
There are different cultural currents that interpret the reality of death and life so differently, very, very differently than one culture might, and so on. And so perhaps I think education is a good place to begin, and to learn and to just do some understanding. And perhaps I can't. Hello.
Yep. You're still with us, Abhi?
Yes.
Yep.
So yes, I mean, and as I was mentioning before, working as a youth work enabler, unfortunately I did had to face some of the issues about 3 or 4 people, young people, committed suicide in my while I was working in my synod. And there were different issues, though. There were a lot of violence and oppression within families, and there were other different issues that was going on. And unfortunately, suicide was the symptom of a deeper illness. That sort of, I'm using that metaphor, sort of a symptom of deeper illness that exists within a family.
Well, I think that's a wonderful metaphor to use, because it actually affirms John's perspective that the starting point is the gift of life. There may be very deep illnesses within life that run deeper than death.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, Abhi, you've really highlighted that. And if we stick with Nahi's question, because I think it's a great question, it impacts on the sexuality issue as well. So the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender issues are interpreted by different cultures differently. Any perspective on that from an Indian perspective, Abhi?
What really interests me about India is that India is one of rare, very rare cultures where we have female god, so goddesses and so on, and yet goddesses, female gods, and in the pantheon of Hinduism and so on. And still, India is such a patriarchal country where it is male dominant and so on. And so, of course, culturally it's very, very conservative, but at the same time, there is sort of a undercurrent of blurriness, gender blurriness, where the lines are a bit blurry and people don't know, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, growing up in India, I just, particularly in a Christian family, I came to learn that homosexuality is wrong, and pretty much heteronormative view and heteronormative interpretation of the Bible, and so on. And so it's only coming into the into West when I came to learn of different perspective and so on, and continue to do so.
Well, that's a very fair answer. John, have you got any thing that you want to say about the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender issue in its own right? Nahi, I think we've answered your question well here, that we do have to take into account different cultural perspectives. But John, you and I had a prior discussion about this and how your church views gay, lesbian.
Well, we tend to be quite open and affirming of GLBT group. For example, we have the Melbourne Gay and Lesbian Chorus, a community choir, practices here at Cannes. In a recent, we're following the lectionary and the Gospel of Mark. We recently had a reading about marriage, and I chose that as an opportunity to reflect on the current issue in Australia, and I believe also in New Zealand, of recognising gay marriage. I think we've got some theological homework to still do on the question, because I think the answer that it's a human right, I think, goes only so far. I think a better category or way of unpacking the issue is actually to go back to having a look at, well, what's the nature of marriage anyway, and the Christian understanding of marriage. And if I can read from the Uniting Church order for marriage, it says, "Marriage is a gift of God and a means of grace. In the lifelong union of marriage, we can know the joy of God, in whose image we are made." Now, this whole idea of marriage being a means of grace, I think, is an interesting one for opening out a way of understanding that from human love we get but a glimpse of the nature of the divine love and the love shown in Christ. It's this sacramental, almost sacramental, strange for Protestants to speak about this, but as almost sacramental nature of marriage, I think, opens out interesting theological points of reflection for how we should understand gay marriage. Yeah, I just put that out there for our people, and we can see where that one goes.
Well, I think in the New Zealand context, yeah. So you go for it, Abhi.
John, what is interesting, you know, when you were saying about the concept of marriage and so on, I was just thinking that this conversation I had with somebody, that what is so Christian about marriage? And marriage, historically speaking, is not really a Christian invention. It predates Christianity, it predates Judaism, and so on. And Christians tend to think that, you know, marriage, they invented marriage, and so on. You know, Indian civilization dates 9,000 years. So, you know, before Christianity or before Judaism, and marriage existed then, and so is Egyptian, and so on. So, and then, you know, and around same-sex marriage and so on, and homosexuality, of course, there are different rhetorics, both for and against, and within the biblical texts and so on. And I personally think that, and this is one area that I'm deeply interested in exploring and so on. And I think that more and more I search sort of Hebrew and Greek, what I find is ambiguity. There is the biblical texts are so ambiguous, and we actually don't know some of the Greek words, what it means now. And what the Paul uses, the term Paul is using to describe same-sex relationship or condemn, as somebody would say, we don't know what that means. And one of them is malakoi. Malakoi is a Greek term which different time has been interpreted as a different word. You know, King James interprets it differently to NRSV, to NIV, and so on. And so it's really interesting. And second thing is that, particularly in our own culture, and I have friends who are from conservative and fundamentalist setting, and we are still friends. Wow, God must be working. So, and they often say that, you know, that homosexuals have choice. So they have choice. They have chosen to this lifestyle, and they can choose to be heterosexual and be normal like us. And what you know, I've never said it to them, but I quietly think that if homosexuals have choice, then does heterosexual also have choice to be heterosexual? So, and if heterosexuals have choice to be heterosexual, then by choosing something, what are we not choosing? And so,
well, I think within your discussion there is needing, on the one hand, recognise the inherent nature of people, and also then how they live their life. I can think of many examples of heterosexual sexuality which is inappropriate. And that could also apply to GLBT sexuality. But insofar as it is part of who people are as a human being, that they are GLBT, then I think we're into a different level of understanding of their situation.
Yeah. Just aware of the time, guys, so we do have to wrap up this discussion.
Yeah.
My perspective on this is that GLBT, heterosexual, it's all part of the human condition. It's all part of who we are. We're creatures. We're not superhuman, divine things. Part of the human condition says there's an infinite variety of places on the spectrum here. But we could debate that further, but I want to say, first of all, thank you, John. Thank you, Abhi, for coming in. Thank you for the 8 or 10 viewers who've been watching the session, and we're really pleased that you put your questions forward. That was marvellous. Now, just a tiny little bit of advertising just before we wrap up for the evening. If you want to do the micro MOOC, you've now got a little task to do. All you've got to do is join the PTR group, watch the 5 videos, which each one lasts about 3-4 minutes, and then put your answer, 40-50 words, into the forum. There's already forum discussion happening there. And then finally, this is the task from this video, just place a feedback comment at the bottom of the micro MOOC page, and that feedback can be quite specific, what you enjoyed about the MOOC, what was not good for you. Remember, we're saying that you can do this MOOC over 7 days in about 2 hours, but by watching these videos you become more professionally developed, more professionally informed, and that happens because you've got presenters like John and Abhi who've been working with these issues: suicide, euthanasia. We didn't get around to the bad dreams, which is my area of expertise, the GLBT, etc. So I want to say to Abhi and John, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the experience. You will get your presenters badges sent to you. You have to claim them. And the people that do the MOOC forums, they get their award as well, and they can claim the badge. You do need to enrol in the Six
You'll have to
Senses
wear it on the forehead.
as the mark of the beast, John. As the mark
Yeah,
of the beast.
okay.
The badge says 666.
Okay.
Yeah. It's been great having you in. I really hope we can get you back in again. I'd love to see a discussion between the two of you and Greg Hewson and possibly Wesophilia Nasa around this key suicide euthanasia debate. This is not going away anytime soon. So without any further ado, thanks for the audience, and we'll see you again next week. We aren't doing a micro MOOC, but there will be a live on air at 7 p.m. and you'll find the link for that, the new link for that, in Night School. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you, and nice to meet you, John. Thank you.
Yep. All right. We're all finished. All done.
We're all going to leave the call. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.